Culture. When I talk about culture, I'm talking about that fundamental, essential, world-building, empire-spanning, almost godlike of things when we talk about culture. Because the right culture, in the best of hands, can be used to make the most amazing and mind-blowing and quite possibly life-altering experience, which ultimately translates into just the most amazing yogurt that you can buy today on the commercial shelf amongst all of the other dairy products. Hello and welcome to this episode of Campaign Creator Series, the series sponsored by World Anvil and DungeonFog. Now, we're looking at culture and how culture can help us with our adventures, as well as how do we create it for our campaign setting. Now, part of our entire plot has been to create these adventures, but each of those adventures needs to take place somewhere, and that somewhere needs to have personality. Personality is basically what we ascribe to cultures. So when we look at culture, I like to look at three things when I think of creating cultures for my campaign world, and I've listed those behind me. That's diversity, game fit, and then the worksheet. So what do I mean by those things? Well, we're going to take you through just what they mean and how they can help you to create a much more interesting culture. And I'm not talking about the dairy kind. So with diversity, we look at diversity in terms of creating lots of different types of culture within our gaming world. Frequently, we only have one or two, or maybe 5 or 6. But when you look at Earth, there are literally thousands of different types of culture out there. I'm not advocating that you have to go and create 1,000 cultures for your fantastical world or your galaxy. It is simply too much to do, and your players are never going to get through it anyway. I am, however, talking about a methodical approach to creating cultures that are quite different from one another. The way that we do that, I think, is in part by inspiration. How do we and where do we get inspiration from? Well, quite frankly, that's turning to the good old-fashioned books or turning to Google when you start to look at different cultures. And what I do when I'm coming up with a culture is, let's say, for example, that we're looking at some kind of Greco-Romanesque time period, somewhere between, say, 600 BC and 100 AD, somewhere around there. What do I look for in terms of inspiration? Well, obviously we've got the Romans, we've got the Greeks. Within the Greeks, we've got the Athenians, we've got the Spartans. We also happen to have the other cultures that are floating around at the same time. The Egyptians are there, the Sumerians, the Scythians, the Thracians, the Gauls, the Germanic tribes, the pirates, there's just so many that are out there. It's difficult not to get inspired. I also then turn to that inspiration and say, well, what is uniquely interesting about those particular cultures? And I do a little bit of research. I go and say, all right, well, let's look at Athens from the time period of, say, 75 BC or even earlier, 300 BC. Let's unpack what made Athens so Athens-esque. Was it the idea of democracy? Was it Socrates running around espousing his ideas? What made Athens Athens? I then look at the expectation. So when we look at the expectation of that time period, if I say Roman, we expect Roman legionnaires moving out en masse, the Senate with multiple leaders being stabbed in the back and in the face. We expect those kinds of things. We expect slavery, we expect games and gladiators. Those are the things that we kind of expect. Then I look at the theme and I say, all right, well, what is the theme for my campaign? The theme is that power corrupts and etc., or that love wins, whatever the case might be. So I look at those three things. I look at some inspirational points from the culture that I'm trying to create. I look at the expectations that come along with that. And then I try and look at the theme to see how I can influence the first two to maybe reflect that theme a little bit better. If, let's say, for example, that it is the strong triumph over the weak, when I look at the expectation of the, the Spartans, then the entire thing, all of the things I'm going to emphasize within those expectations are the strong triumphing over the weak being thrown off those cliffs, babies that are born with defects and the like. The Spartans would just chuck them off a cliff into a very specific area. So there's that kind of thing that's going to come through. The monsters that are going to be in that area are also going to be about embodying strength rather than guile and the like. So I use those three things to try and give me a sense of diversity. So I might have two Greek cultures right next to each other, as I actually do in my particular campaign, but I can give them quite different feelings by looking at the expectations and trying to highlight certain expectations. So the arena type of combat that the Romans had. If I look at it, you could have certain cultures that focus on the arena type of stuff and others that absolutely abhor it. What would the Romans have done if they didn't have an arena, a circus maximus, where they could have their games and express the frustrations of the crowd? How would the Roman senators have maintained control over the population? What would they have done? Would they have then maybe, instead of having these massive violent concerts, would they have perhaps had massive musical concerts, which is what we do today? Would they have had massive sporting events? Again, what we do today. Would they not have maybe then just completely eradicated the idea of mass gatherings, and anyone who gathers in groups of more than 3 or 4 either need to be gathering for a political reason or they're going to get arrested? So by looking at the expectations and then asking, well, what if they're not there? What if we turn them on their heads? We start to create an amazing sense of diversity within the cultures that we're now adding to our world. We could also look at it and say, well, what if the Romans had human sacrifice? Let's bring in some of the Aztec influence into the Roman world. What would we do if there was human sacrifice? Well, slaves would suddenly have a very different sort of approach. You know, slaves suddenly are going to be used as human sacrifice rather than mass labor. So slaves need to be protected, or do we only use the enemies that we go for? That again would change Rome's approach to creating empire. We're not going to simply take over your country and then let you continue ruling it, which is what they pretty much did. We're going to take over your kingdom and decimate it of all of its population, because we're going to sacrifice those to our gods. We're going to install our own population therein. Two very different approaches that result in very different types of empire, types of mentality that then go with it. I then look and say, okay, so if we're going to have, let's say, a Roman civilization where the arena no longer exists and it's now all just very hush-hush, we've got the Senate that exists, we've got the Roman politicians that are going around, but now everyone spies on everyone else, and order is maintained by terror. So there are these centauri which monitor the streets, and a secret network, the secretari or whatever they're going to be called, that look for deviant behavior and the like. Perhaps underground, there's underground fights that go on, because we still want to speak to the Roman theme. That's why we've chosen them as our culture, or whichever culture you happen to have chosen. We then look at mechanics. What would the mechanics be? What would differentiate this particular culture from somewhere else? So the mechanics would be a spy network. It would be a reign of terror and of phobia about your neighbor seeing what you're doing and reporting you to the secret police. So mechanically, that's how that environment would work. And it's important to try and understand mechanically how your culture works as well. If I were to say, look at South Africa, and I would say, right, let's look at that culture. Sport mechanically brings people together in that country. It does in most countries. That's one of the reasons why it's so globally popular. But it really is a reflection. If you play this type of sport in the culture, you're that type of person. If you play this type of sport, you're that type of person. These are the types of arenas that get built en masse. These are the types of stadiums and things that get built elsewhere. So we then look at mechanically, how do those cultures work? What keeps them ticking over and what keeps them in power? That's the other important thing, is what keeps them in power. Something has to do that, and that's the mechanics of that particular culture. We then look at pacing. How is it going to then affect our pacing? If we have a very bureaucratic culture, which requires signatures and dockets and the like, is that going to slow down gameplay, or is it going to enhance gameplay through narrative drive? Most of the time it's going to slow down gameplay. So try and think of ways in which the culture can speed things along. Is there an undercity culture? Is there a black market that would allow the characters to purchase those weapons that they want to purchase to blow up City Hall? How do they get there? So what is going to contribute to the pacing of your culture? How does that fit within your game? It's very important to think about that. And when you think about transportation as part of the culture, the transportation culture of, say, Japan, of London, of New York is the subway and the trains that move around on that. There's very specific cultures that come with those. Having been on the London Underground recently and on the Tokyo Underground is absolutely quiet. Nobody talks. The moment you step on the train, the very first thing you hear is, please turn your cell phones off and refrain from talking. Definitely a very different situation when you're on the London Underground, where casual conversation is absolutely fine. And people have desperate conversations on their cell phones where everyone can hear. So different culture, same idea. The pacing, however, is then very different as well. If you are running a game where there is mass transport, whether it's a subway or a giant slithery eel that everyone rides on, or it's a transportation technology, a teleportation technology, what is the culture that then goes with that, and how does that help the pacing of your game? South Africa doesn't have an underground system really, so that means transportation is limited to vehicles, horses, possibly aeroplanes in certain limited regions. There are massive trains that transport goods and things around, but that's going to give you a very different pace to your game as opposed to someone that's got an instant access network. And then what are the adventures that come out of that culture? If you have a culture that's so oppressive, that's so dark, such as one where everyone's spying on everybody else, what adventures could you possibly have that come out of that? And do those adventures contribute towards a happy player or not? So in an environment where there's lots of spying going on, and if you say the wrong thing, you're immediately arrested, well, that's already affecting your pacing, because now your characters are not free to move around the city because they are going to make mistakes. Point number one. Point number two is that really what the players want their characters to go through? Trying to escape from this prison? Is that part of the narrative? In which case, that's absolutely fine. But remember, we're talking about creating interesting and different cultures for your campaign world. That means that another section, another culture that's right next door, or that is a similar culture, a Romanesque culture, need not have that. And shouldn't have that, because if they all have that, then you're not creating diverse cultures, you're just copying and pasting. So when you then look at what adventures are potentially hinted at, what adventures come to mind when you are building this particular culture, with the mechanics of how they operate, with the pacing of how they operate? If you get a plethora of ideas, if you suddenly go, yes, this is fantastic. Look at all of these different adventures. We've got the subway adventure. We've got the teleportation adventure. We've got the sporting adventure. We've got the this adventure. We've got the that adventure. If lots of adventures present themselves, it's a winner. But if you start going, well, there's the home inquest, then there's the home arrest, then there's the sedation and restraint, is that really something that you want in your world? It might be very thematic. It might be very poignant for the place that you happen to be in. But if it's so limited, you should make sure that the players have the opportunity of getting in and out so that they can experience just a taste of it and not get stuck there for too long. So if they get stuck there for too long, that's going to be a problem. It really is. And then I look at a worksheet. I like to have worksheets for my cultures that I can make sure that when I am working through my areas on my maps, that I do have a lot of different cultures that are quite diverse and that have different feelings to them, so that when the players walk into those cultures, when their characters arrive in those different cultures, they can definitely feel that they have arrived in a different kind of culture. So I look for worksheets, and I'm going to go and show you the World Anvil worksheet because it does a whole lot of these things, which is what I think a worksheet should do. So a worksheet should give you some kind of direction. So whether this is a template that you've created yourself, or if you're going to be using World Anvil, which I certainly would advocate because it does it all for you, you need something that's going to give you inspiration, that's going to give you a sense of direction, that's going to give you some prompts, that's going to really help to make the process easier. Some people enjoy doing these kind of cultural things. Some people kind of go, well, I kind of have to. So it's a bit of a grudge action. Some people hate doing it. They're intimidated by doing it. By having a worksheet that gives you a sense of direction, it sometimes can remove that overwhelming feeling of where do you even start. Consistency is the next important thing. The worksheet allows you to create, here is culture number 1, here is culture number 2, and they have been thought out and developed sufficiently to the same level so that there aren't little areas that kind of feel backwashy or easy. Or you want your gaming experience, you want your game world to feel as if it is as developed and rich wherever you go, regardless of how actually developed and rich it is. So by having a worksheet, you get a consistency. You know the leaders, you know the culture, you know what makes it tick, you know how it works, etc., etc., etc. And then by having a workspace in which you can keep all of the stuff, so whether you're printing it out and putting it in a big LeverArch file as we used to do back in the day, or whether you are using something like World Anvil where it is all just displayed and protected for you, is entirely up to you. So let's have a look at this World Anvil that I keep going on about. I've got a template open behind me. This is their ethnicity template, which is what I will be using for my culture. So let's say we're going to be looking at the culture of Gypthos. No, not Gypthos, Utherios. So the entire hegemony, because it is different cultures, has a singular culture. So the Utherios hegemony. All right, so again, timestamps will be below so that you can start skipping through this process as I work through it. But now the World Anvil template has got a whole lot of different things for me up here, and then it's got a whole lot of prompts down here. These prompts, by the way, are going to help my players just as much as they're going to help me. So I'm not going to fill in the vignette just yet. I want more information first before I get there. So, family names. What are the family names that might come through from the Utherios hegemony? Now, this is based very, very roughly on a Greek style of culture where there are 4 major cities. Those major cities are each independently operated, but collectively they operate the whole of the Utherios hegemony under a king. So when we think of family names, I think that I always like, instead of prescribing the entire name, I always like to prescribe suffixes and prefixes that allow the player to create a name and then just add on. Some players have difficulty trying to fit their character into the culture that the GM has created. So by adding on a prefix or a suffix, suddenly the name they've created is still there, it's still theirs, but it now fits within it. So I'm going to create some prefixes here. Prefix obviously goes in front of prefix. How do you spell prefix? Prefix, there we go. Prefix, it goes in front of the name. So if you had the family name of Brown, for example, I don't know how that's going to work. Let's see, I'm going to say Adios. No, Adio. Let's say Uli. Def. Oxy Mio Gorgo. Let's see now. Sock. Socky Sky. This is really just Zol. Let's do that. Okay, so those are prefixes, and then suffixes. We're going to add 80s, os, eos, ios, olos, ix, ini, ii, which is however ii, ini, ei, I should say, and let's say opos, and then let's say 80s. Oh, we've already got 80s. Opos, and then let's just say los. There we go. So when you put them together, you could have adios, adiilos, adiolos, adiox, adii, adiopos, adiolos, uliates, ulios, ulix, uliini, uliinii, oxylos, oxyos, oxyades, meades. There's just a whole bunch you can come up with, and of course the character puts the one in the front. I said the word brown. Let's see how that would work out as a curiosity. Defbranates. It's not bad considering that we started with the word brown. I would then say let's drop the B, so defronates. Defronates. I don't think it's too bad. I could live with that. Let's say oxronates. Oxronates definitely sounds Greek to me. Oxonates sounds even better. Anyway, the character can now play around with as so they choose. When it comes to female names and masculine names, we can certainly choose what to add there without a doubt. Although with this prefix and suffix, I think we're certainly on the right track. The players won't need to worry too much about anything along those lines. Now, when it comes to ideals, this is where we start to really unpack the power of these templates in terms of creating a real sense of whom we are dealing with. Now, when we talk beauty ideals, let's just think about Japan, for example. The beauty ideals of a samurai warrior was to have a shaved central part to their head and then a top knot at the back, which is not particularly beautiful by today's standards. If we flit over to Renaissance Europe, a voluptuous woman is someone who is seen as beautiful, not the anorexic skeletons that wander around by today's standards. If you go to, say, Zulu culture, a voluptuous woman with childbearing hips is someone who's far more attractive than someone who is thin and skinny without very much hippage, as one might call it. From a masculine perspective, the moustache and beard were seen as a sign of maturity in the 1800s. Then they were seen as a sign of obscurity and bad grooming in the 1900s, in the turn of the century. And then suddenly they've come back again. As far as Western culture is concerned, in Japan, again, a very different perspective. The beard is seen as the mark of someone who's about to commit evil and is not looked upon as something that one would necessarily want to have. So there are these very interesting beauty ideals that come out. So when we think of the beauty ideals of Greece and of the Eutherios hegemony in particular, I think we have to go back to the idea of, well, what inspires us about Grecian beauty? And I think the thing that we need to, the thing that we need to look at is, what do we expect? Well, we expect curls, we expect the sort of the statuesque like stuff. It depends on what you've been exposed to. So I think that the beauty ideals will be brown hair and eyes, oval faces, and strong noses. I think a erect and tight figure, so they stand correctly, they don't slouch, there's no bad body posture, and a strong scent of, what flower do I think of when I think of Greece? The olive comes to mind, and a strong scent of olives in the perfume, say, for example. I think that gives us a sense of who this culture is, and it gives us an opportunity to create NPCs quite quickly with that. When we look at gender ideals, do we want to ascribe gender ideals? That's entirely up to you. Courtship ideals, these are a lot of fun to add in, and they do bring in some amazing things. I think with courtship ideals, I think that we should add in a little cultural thing here. If the Greeks are about a hegemony, it's two individuals coming together, what could be the symbol of them coming together? And as far as I'm concerned, when I look at the Greeks, I think of Greek heroes, I think it's an exchange. So I think an exchange, I can't spell today, exchange of clay pots indicates intent to marriage and work together. Smashing clay pots results in dissolution of marriage. I think that could be quite interesting. Customs. Oh, this is where it gets so much fun. We start to add in different things. I think that's really, really, really cool. So customary codes. I think it should be the elbow to wrist embrace. That's this embrace, elbow to wrist. Embrace upon meeting, at the very least. Major languages we can come back to, but I think it's going to be Etherii is the language that they speak, which is basically going to be the common in my world. Now, common etiquette, I think it should be to share. Everything shared, I think, would work quite nicely. Dress code, art, architecture, cultural heritage. Oh, we can just go on and on and on. There is so much here. Coming of age rights. I love this. Taboos. What does one not do? And I think this one should be draw a sword or a blade in public. I think that's definitely a taboo. I know that's taboo for most places, but I think specifically here, draw a blade in public. Myths and legends we're going to fill in. Attained technological levels. That's where we start talking about that transportation again. Major stock. I mean, this is why these templates are here. They really help us. What are the major organizations within that? So, is it a secret society? Is it a this? Is it a that? And then, of course, what locations is it limited to? If we had set up locations and things. So, again, this is just the power. Let me just save this before I forget that. Forget to do that anyway. And let's have a preview of it, because World Anvil also does a very different layout, so it looks quite nice. Quite easy to read, quite easy to follow through. Going, okay, cool. This is the layout specifically made for us, for the channel. You'll notice it looks very similar to the layout that we use for our adventure modules and things for our Patreons, but here we can very easily see this shorthand coming through of different things, and we can give this to our players. We can format it better so that it's a little bit more legible. I can come in here and make these bold and put a new line somewhere. I can do that. I need to remember. I can't remember. Anyway, we can make that bold so that it really stands out in the document that we develop. Yeah, so there are many things that we can do with a template like this. And what it will also do, what I particularly like, is it will keep us consistent. So that it means moving on, is that all of our articles, all of our cultural countries will have the same thing. And if we want to add or we want to change something, we can go back to the template and we can just update it. Anyway, those are my thoughts on how we develop culture. Let me go back to these where we talk about consistency, we talk about direction. That's what we want in our worksheets. But in terms of culture, diversity, game fit, Those are the critical elements when it comes to creating culture. Doing the actual nuance of all those things that you want to create, that's about finding your inspiration and then drawing on it and changing your expectation. Until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of creation. Another good thing about this particular dairy product, this culture of yogurt, is that pretty much everybody likes it. Not everyone subscribes, which is okay, but if you do subscribe, you're going to find that you get a rich return. You're going to have good intestinal action. It's really going to help you with bowel movements and the things like that. And for that, you probably would want to have some kind of bell nearby to warn people that you're internally okay.